Good afternoon. This is Safe and Safe Country podcast, and me, its author and host, Alina Frlova. Just to remind you that in my podcast, we're speaking about security in broader meaning of this. We speak about the security of the country, of Europe, of world, about personal security. We discuss those things which can influence on our daily life and which can influence on how we shall win this war and what would be after the war. There are many questions, not so many answers, but this is why we're here, to discuss and to know. This podcast is produced jointly by the Center for Defense Strategies, Ukrainskaya Pravda, and Media Center Ukraine. You can find us on all the resources of Ukrainskaya Pravda, as well as on other largest podcast platforms, Apple, YouTube, Spotify, SoundCloud, and others. Yes, we are on YouTube now, and you can listen us there too. Don't forget to subscribe. Today, I would like to speak about very, personal for all of the Ukrainian topic. We all now monitoring what's going on in Georgia. Actually, those latest events which are boost up the very high civil activity and very high civil participation in the identifying where the country is going, they are so reminding us Ukraine in 2014. And sometimes it looks like a very copy-paste situation. And so we are very emotionally there with our Georgian friends. And yes, I invited to speak to me about everything from the ground, my friend, which I'm happy to know, Givi Chanukvadze, international development expert and associate professor at Ilyas State University in Tbilisi. Just one note that Givi is invited to participate in this podcast as an individual expert. Therefore, all his views expressed today are his own and do not represent those of his employer. Givi, welcome.
Thank you, Alina. Thank you for having me.
Givi, you have very proficient experience in different spheres in Georgia. Over 15 years, you were represented in governmental service. We just discussed before this podcast started that you were executive manager of the public service halls, which in Ukraine are called SNAP. And it was first such a service in post-Soviet countries, and you were leading the biggest one in Tbilisi. This gives you significant experience within the government. Additionally, you have experience in non-governmental organizations. Currently, you're working with different development partners, and this is some part of your life from where you can see the attitude of foreign publics to everything what's going on in Georgia. So you have a very diverse points of view, 3D so-called. Tell us your feelings about what's going on and describe the situation as it is for now.
Thank you, Alina, for this opportunity actually to speak to your audience. And it's an honor actually to bring the on-the-ground flavor, actually, what's happening in Georgia. In your introduction, you briefly outlined my background, and you're right. For the last more than 15 years of my professional experience and actually of professional being, but it goes beyond professional being, actually, of being a citizen of this country. The core trajectory for me as formerly a civil servant and then representing the civil society or academic organizations or different developmental partners on the ground, the core of my being as an individual, it was a very clear trajectory of a citizen of Georgia. And as the person who's been actually in the center of different reforms from the very beginning after the Rose Revolution as well. And this was very clear Euro-Atlantic trajectory of this country. And we've seen many ups and downs, actually, in Georgia's history for the last 30 years. Many political crises, many ups and downs, which is absolutely normal when you are trying to leave the orbit of Russian influence and leave this cliche of post-Soviet country. And it's really difficult. And we had many successes as a country, but many, many failures as well. But we knew for sure one thing. This country has been moving towards one very, very clear direction. And this is Euro-Atlantic integration. And it was actually cornerstoned in our constitution back in 2018. And according to different public opinion polls, more than 80% of Georgian citizens are supporting, and they've been supporting this very clear direction. And that's the request that is coming from citizens of this country. But what we are seeing today in Georgia and what we've been observing for the last month and a half, it's the crisis. It is the existential crisis of this country. And it is pretty shocking for the person who's been actually, in the part of different developments. As I said, many ups and downs, but clear direction. And on one day, we just received a very clear signal from ruling elite that potentially this country might change the trajectory. There have been a lot of speculations, rumors, activities, actions that we've been observing, especially which actually escalated after the Russian-Ukraine war, when the Russian troops invaded Ukraine soil. And that's when many things got worse, actually, in Georgia, especially in Georgian-Ukrainian relationship. But we saw also some of the very unpleasant actions taken by the government of Georgia. But in parallel, citizens of Georgia have been supporting fully Ukrainians in this war against Russia. But clearly, in the beginning of April, with the introduction of so-called Russian law, which is a copy and paste of Russian sort of methodology to shrink the space, space for democracy, for active citizenship, and shrink the space or the appetite for moving towards the Euro-Atlantic integration. But beyond that, the ruling elite, despite almost every day seeing hundreds of thousands of protesters in the center of Tbilisi, but not only in Tbilisi, especially in all those big cities around Georgia, the ruling elite has been neglecting very clear will of Georgian citizens that this law is against their will. This law is against that demand that is coming from citizens of Georgia to integrate in Euro-Atlantic institutions. And in parallel, all those friends of Georgia from Europe, from the US and other countries are telling us that this is a clear red line for us. Despite that fact, despite that internal domestic pressure and external pressure, ruling elite is moving forward and doesn't want to see this clear picture or hear this clear message from internal society and external. It really makes shocking for this country, because with this move, especially after that speech of honorary chairman of Georgian Dream, Bidzina Ivanishvili, on April 29th, that was pretty eye-opening for many of us, when he clearly brought very intriguing messages in his speech, clearly accused our strategic partners that they are against of Georgia, and brought sort of some warning signals that the trajectory will be changed and will be shifted. And we can guess, where this trajectory might move. So that was pretty shocking for the society and eye-opening, actually.
Okay, we saw all those protesters, and actually for me it was quite enormous, not like a very impressive figure when I read that Georgia has more than 25,000 of NGOs inside the Georgia. And obviously the quite vibrant civil society life started after Eduard Shevardnadze, and actually Shevardnadze was moved on also with the support of the active civil society.
Mm-hmm.
Then we remember the times of Saakashvili. Mm-hmm. Saakashvili also actually lost his power because of the active population, because the activism.
Yeah. And based on the election outcome,
yes,
based on the election, this was the first precedent in Georgia's history, Alina, for you to know that, 2012 elections, peaceful transfer of the power from Saakashvili's government to Bidzina Ivanishvili's government, this was the first precedent for Georgia's political life to have peaceful transfer.
And so you have this like some kind of already established tradition of the vibrant civil society. It's well known, it's understandable. And you have at the same time this like quite a big pressure from the current government, which obviously understands that you cannot disappear in one month, in 1 year even. Yes, all of those who were on the streets, and we saw this massive presence. And when we look at the Ukrainian, let's say, picture in 2014. Actually, when I said that this is almost the same, I'm just now looking at the phases which were happening in Ukraine in 2014. And the first, it was a protest against suspension of Euro Association, which actually is happening inside your country now.
Mm-hmm.
Then it was a demand for Yanukovych to resign, and our government didn't react at this. Then Titushki appeared, which we saw already the same approach at your protests. Then we have these anti-civil laws, which were adopted by the parliament of Ukraine, where we have the same with you. Then we started to have a violence and the protests, and negotiations lead to nothing. And then we started to see the killings of protesters and major attacks of the security services. And afterwards, we faced, yes, Yanukovych left, but as a country, we faced the war. And we do understand that the price which we're paying now with this war with Russia, this is actually the price for being active and choosing our own destiny. And obviously, we saw some kind of the beginning of this process in Belarus a few years ago, yes, and it comes to nothing. It was just like a peaceful process. And the moment when government started to make a pressure, all those people just went home and agreed for some suppressions, leaving the country and so on. Georgia is obviously moving in the direction which was in Ukraine. And if this is so, and if the government choose this way of moving forward, knowing that you will be active, knowing that you will oppose, knowing that you will just like a protest, it's very high probability that there would be violence, there would be escalation, and probably there would be other circumstances for the Georgian citizens, which we observe now in Ukraine.
Yeah.
Are Georgians discussing this? Are you ready for this? What are the moods inside this active part of the civilians?
That's a very good question, Alina. And maybe to go back to those narratives, actually, what we see from the government propaganda actually quite actively disseminated the last few months is that warfare narrative, actually, that the Georgian dream is the only source, actually, to secure peace in Georgia, for Georgia, and not to drag Georgia into the war with Russia. And that's a very strong narrative that, to be honest, is working very well. I mean, and based on different polls, actually, and it's understandable, right? I mean, Georgians still remember those wounds actually are pretty fresh from 2008. And they can trigger those reactions very easily. So components of psychological operation and information operation, we see those components pretty effectively working on the ground. Yeah, so this warfare narrative is there, and it's very actively broadcasted by different means, including by the traditional media, by the government, by the local government representatives, and on the social media as well. So in terms of the protests and the amount of people that we see, and I think I said that this is unprecedented, actually, for Georgia to have around 300,000 people coming out in the streets. It's unprecedented. We've never seen in Georgia these amounts of people being ready actually to openly say no to Russia. And this is about that. This is about that idea. It's not only about Russian law. And we all understand that this is just a component of a big strategy, of a bigger picture that we've been seeing, especially after 2012. And I think we should see these particular developments in a big picture. And the Russian law, so-called Russian law about foreign agents, it's one aspect of a bigger problem that Georgia has been facing historically from its independence. So it's mentally, for us, we know that we've been fighting our northern neighbor for generations. So this is not new for any of us. We exactly know with whom we are fighting with. So I think realization that Georgia is in its sort of existential phase, it's there. However, I think, as I said, the government propaganda is still working very well. And many things should be done on that front in order to counter those narratives that are coming from government propaganda channels, because again, this warfare narrative is very powerful. And the model that I see, or the government is trying to propose or to draw for ordinary Georgian citizen, it's sort of to create sort of a fortress in Georgia. And in geopolitical terms, it would mean that it would have sort of just economic relationships with Russia and bring sort of benefits to ordinary citizens. Then they will create a sort of a peaceful environment for Georgians. They will make sure they don't engage in any conflicts with Russia. So this is something that Georgian government is trying actually to sell to ordinary citizens. I would say the audience that they are targeting, it's not the young generation. And the driving force, what we see in this case, and that's the most amazing, that what we see, Alina, here in the streets of Tbilisi, the driving force of these protests, it's completely different. And when I say that we've never seen this type of protest, it's very bottom to up. It's without any political leadership. We can argue whether it's good or bad, of course, but it's subject of another discussion. But the nature of protest is absolutely different. It's very genuine. And that's where Georgian Dream is very much lost, actually. They don't know how to counter that protest. And they've been trying, actually, to hire those thugs, to beat those people in the streets, but they can't stop them. On another day, another 100,000 people are coming out in the streets. So they are in a pretty tough situation as well, because they know exactly that if they openly say that they are moving towards Russia, it's a political suicide. It's a political suicide for any Georgian politicians, because according to different polls and the latest election result, only 5% of citizens support close alliance with Russia, and 95% say that they don't want to see Georgia aligned with Russia. So that's where Georgian Dream is trying actually to make sure that to navigate, in this environment, and to make sure that they win October elections and they secure another 4 years to rule this country.
I do remember how I was standing on Krishatik in 2014, and I was just expecting, because it was also announced that people go on the streets, let's make a demonstration, let's show our disagreement. And the people were gathering near the university, which is a little bit higher, and you don't see how many people are there. And I was standing on Krishatik and waiting when the first line will come. And it was one of the biggest fears that there would be too little people. And when I saw that demonstration, it was around 600,000. This huge movement of people, it was like a river of the people coming. I did understood at that moment that I'm happy to be the part of this nation, and we have a chance, quite a big chance, for changing our life in this country. And I do understand your feeling about what you saw on your streets. And this is really very promising.
And Alina, very quickly also, to reiterate this amount of supporters. You can debate about in which and how you run this country, how you navigate or how you lead this country towards Euro-Atlantic integration. But 95% of citizens of this country are saying that they don't want to be affiliated with Russia. And this is a small country. To suppress 95% with violence in this small country, it's just 3.7. Everyone knows each other. It is really difficult. I don't rule out, right? It's of course possible. We've never seen in Georgia's history, actually, Georgian army going against Georgians. We've never seen that. We've never seen massively police forces going against. And of course, there were violations, the clashes, etc. But, at some point, they will also need to justify within the system, within the regime, within that group, that they are relying to stand, right? It's private sector, it's business, large businesses, it's those members of the parliament, etc. And it will be really difficult, actually, for Georgian Dream to prolong this, or to suppress pretty long time, right? This amount of people. So they are in a pretty difficult situation as well, because, they need to control the regime as well. And it's pretty difficult for them.
Okay, so In this point, you also mentioned one very important issue, that there is no political leadership of this protest, which we also faced in Ukraine. And this is bad and good, yes, as you told. But your president, Salome Zurabishvili, she is insisting on that you need to wait to the election and re-elect the power authorities as much as you wish. At the same time, we do understand that this is like almost half a year till the election.
Absolutely.
Within the half a year, the authorities who have a power in their hands, who has police, we see how actively they now try to oppress activists, like putting their photo with some signs on the streets and saying that this is betrayals of Georgia and so on. So they will just try as much as possible to use this period to oppress the opposition, to take control the television, radio, whatever, any broadcasting, to control the information space and to control physical space with police, with other authorities. So many things, bad things can happen within this half a year. So what is your vision for the next steps? What would be next before election? How the situation can develop, and what do you expect at elections?
Yeah, and that's something that we all have been thinking, actually, because as I said in the beginning, it started pretty unexpectedly. We all have been expecting sort of somewhere, having a bit of a peaceful summer, and then in September, this active re-election time to be started. But surprisingly, it all started in the beginning of April. And it must have its rationale, right? I mean, the Georgian dream. And they were pretty open, actually, that they will try actually to squeeze out, to tire the nation and the opposition and civil society actually with the protests, and then to suppress, to fear, and then they won't be able actually to be active in the pre-election time, etc. So, as you said, I mean, Salome Zurabishvili, the president of Georgia, has shown her strengths, to be honest, and she's trying to act as a sort of facilitator of all those Western opposition parties, and she's trying, and still the opposition parties are in the process of, I mean, they are deciding which strategy to choose, right? Whether to unite under one roof or get into the elections individually, etc. So they are very actively discussing. Actually, this process and where we stand now is that, and it's a very interesting time, because all those massive protests, of course, you can't last all those. I mean, you can't make 300,000 protests every evening, right? So it has its sort of energy, and sometimes it goes, I mean, it declines, right? And we see that moment that the political parties are now forced actually and forced to show the clear vision to people, those who've been protesting in the streets. What's the vision? Because we all understand that this process without political component can't last or cannot be translated into something that we would love to see. So we all understand that political component must be part of this protest. And you should know also that the political opposition has been struggling with their reputation. Generally, politicians and political opposition has been very much sort of, struggling in terms of rankings, support, etc. They've been pretty divided. It's a subject of different discussions, of course, but generally, Georgia has been struggling with political opposition, and now the political opposition is facing that moment that they understand that this is the moment when they need to engage, because they saw from the ground, from the bottom, that there is a huge energy coming out from the population of a clearly demanding change. There are clear messages coming out from our Western partners that they are supporting the people of Georgia. They are supporting Georgia's Euro-Atlantic trajectory. So politicians now need to reflect on that and be one of the strong components of that resistance against the ruling party, and they need to lead the nation towards the elections. How it will be done, of course, that's subject of a strategy. As I said, there are different strategies being discussed together with the president, without her, etc. But I think that political opposition is now very much, I mean, they understand that that's the moment when they must show a clear vision how we are getting to the elections. That will be a very challenging 5 months. We will see. And plus, that's what we've been discussing, actually, that every day the context is changing. Every day, whenever you plan something, on a very personal level, to be honest, whenever you plan something, then next day, everything turns up and down. So I think we will see very soon more clearer vision from the political opposition, how they will contribute to that general resistance that is again led by just ordinary citizens.
And talking about opposition, unfortunately, here in Ukraine, we, except Saakashvili, we don't know anyone who is some kind of being a leader of opposition, or at least what parties are those which has some popularity inside Georgia. Saakashvili is not very popular also, as soon as I understand.
However, the United Nations movement, his political party, remains the largest political opposition, still according to all those public opinion polls. United Nations movement still remains the largest opposition party in Georgia. However, we see other players, and that reflects Georgian political class has been struggling in terms of diversity as well. And we can argue whether it was sort of a result of this polarized political environment, fight between the Georgian Dream and the United Nations movement, and then all other forces have been sort of withdrawn from the political arena. But so far, what we see now, signs of almost all those political opposition parties that they clearly agree that they should be very strategic in order to guide the nation in this very critical situation. I mean, how they will be doing all together or individually, but they all understand that Georgia is facing existential threat. And this is the momentum when Georgia might continue its Euro-Atlantic trajectory, or we might lose all those results that we've obtained, actually, by the fight of various generations. So the odds are pretty high. And I think we all understand that. And I hope that the political opposition will be smart enough, actually, to make the decision which help the people of Georgia, actually, to peacefully transfer the power.
Do you believe in peaceful transfer of power, even if opposition will win the election?
I believe, and again, we had that experience. Back in 2012, when Saakashvili transferred the power, there were many skeptics that there will be violence, etc., etc. But this country clearly showed its political culture and clearly showed that example that we can peacefully transfer the power to another political entity. So I think that if the opposition is strategic enough, together in combination with our friends outside of Georgia and with this enormous support from ordinary citizens, and especially all those people, that young generation, I think there is a high chance that the Georgian Dream government will be able actually to say no to violence and leave the power to those who will be winners. But, one of the scenarios that Georgia might be expecting is the coalition government. So we are not talking about, again, having one ruling party. And that's something that Georgia might be facing, actually, after October elections. And we might face coalition government as well, that we have never experienced as well. So Georgia is in a very, very interesting stage, actually, of a lot of changes. I think I'm very optimistic in terms of that drive that is coming from people of Georgia and that support that we are receiving from our friends. However, we should all remember again, and you were very clearly reminding me the examples of Ukraine and Belarus. And the playbook that Russia is following is very much known. So there are risks that that optimism might be crushed in a moment. So let's see. But clearly, elections are the way out from this crisis. But as you said, 5 months are left, and many things can happen in these 5 months.
You have also one player inside Georgia who can make the difference. I'm speaking about Georgian Orthodox Church. Yes, it was always influential, and visiting Georgia many times, I saw how respectful most of people are, like listening and having very respectful attitude towards the church. On April 17th, Prime Minister of Georgia gave the press conference where he said that non-governmental organization attempted to organize a revolution, attack and discredit the Georgian Orthodox Church, spread LGBT propaganda, and initiate direct armed conflict with Russia as a second front of Russia-Ukrainian war. So it was like yes, this is again looks like a very playbook of Russians, but at the same time, I saw one of the notes that Georgian Orthodox Church denounced the bill call it not only non-Christian, but also a violation of the constitution. Does it mean that the church openly supported protesters? And does church play now some kind of substantial role in everything what's going on there on the ground?
Thanks for bringing that stakeholder in this discussion. And you very rightly mentioned that the Georgian Orthodox Church remains one of the most influential actors in Georgian politics. That's, of course, sign of a political maturity of this country. And that's really unfortunate that despite that clear division on the constitutional level, actually, of church and the government, still attempts or the impact that the religious organization can have on their political developments is massive. And we've seen in Georgia's history, actually, a few examples when Georgian Orthodox Church has been very impactful in terms of development. So far, and I've been very much closely monitoring, to be honest, that particular angle. And so far, except individual representatives of a hierarchy of Orthodox Church and the Patriarch's office, I wouldn't say that the Orthodox Church is very actively supporting either government or the opposition. They are, as an institution, they are trying to play a very safe game, and that's the tactic and strategy that we've seen again in Georgia's history. Though, despite that, we haven't seen sort of supportive statement to the government actions, etc., that I personally was expecting that they would support. They are, again, as an institution, very careful in their statements. However, traditionally and historically, what we've been seeing in Georgia's Orthodox Church as an institution, unfortunately, their influence and their ability actually to contribute to Russian-style information narratives and Russian propaganda on the ground is massive. So far, I should point out that the Orthodox Church has been playing a very powerful role of channeling Russian-style propaganda on the ground. So in terms of these particular protests, the institution itself is pretty careful because, again, they see this massive amount of people. And amongst those protesters, amongst those hundreds of thousands of people and young people, there are very religious people, but again, being against Russia and Russian law, and they want to move towards the Euro-Atlantic integration. So they understand that. And they are very, very smart organization. So I think they will continue observing what's happening on the ground. And then they, of course, will try to be relatively clear in their position in terms of these particular developments in Tbilisi.
You mentioned a few times that the population is not against Russia, but actually against Russia imposing some kind of influence on Georgia. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we know that after the start of the full-scale invasion, many Russians flew to Georgia. They live there. There are a lot of Russian language on the street. And Georgia is not supporting sanction policy. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of suspicious moves in that regard, where we do understand that through Georgia, we have some kind of illegal traffic of those goods and supplies which are going actually to Russia. So on one hand, we have active population which is not supporting Russia in this war and Russia in this situation. At the other hand, those Russians are still there and they still taking a part in some kind of local life. And this is actually based on Ukrainian experience. This is a very dangerous situation because at the moment of specific danger, at the moment of existential danger, those Russians can play a role against the active population. What do you think about this? What is the real attitude of the people on the streets towards Russians and towards Russian behavior?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question, Alina. And I think we've been discussing that. We discussed that many times, and that was really unfortunate when first, literally after the invasion of Russia in Ukraine, actually, the actions that the government of Georgia, or inactions actually, that they showed in order to support the sanctions regime, or even on a rhetoric level, that was really devastating to me and to many Georgians as well, because we saw thousands of Georgians coming out in the streets and protesting and supporting publicly, including our president, Salome Zurabishvili, as well. So again, on the citizen level, on the population level, you have this massive support to Ukraine and being against the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And they do understand that if Ukraine doesn't win, then who's next, right? We all understand that. I mean, on the population level. But unfortunately, again, the ruling elite has been distancing actually from the actual demands of citizens of this country. And they've been playing actually on different sentiments of this country, of the population. And I started this conversation with warfare narrative. And that warfare narrative has been working because they do understand, and the Russian playbook knows very well actually how to influence actually post-Soviet citizens. They know very well which channels, what words to choose in order to impact their mindset. So on one hand, they are, of course, supporting Ukraine in this fight. But at the same time, especially in the regions where you have Georgian Dream's major bank of supporters, the knowledge, the awareness is pretty low. And so that's where they are playing around, using different narratives, etc. So on population level, and again, that's why we are getting very clear that this is very clear state capture when the ruling party is not anymore representing the real demands of this population, and they've been playing their own business game.
Yeah, it's again very similar to situations which we had in Ukraine. And unfortunately, we have a time limit and we need to end up our conversation. But what I would like to tell you that we are really feeling very emotional involvement in everything what's going on in Georgia. We support Georgian people. We do appreciate constant support from the people and participation of Georgian Legion in our fight for freedom and for our country. And I hope that history won't repeat in such a copy-paste variant, that you will avoid many of those dangers which Ukraine jumped into. And I wish that those democratic elections would happen and you will re-elect and everything would be peaceful. Although, all my experience of facing with Russia, with living near the Russia, unfortunately gives the feeling that this is very questionable way of doing business.
I agree. I hope that many of us, we've learned lessons in Ukraine and in Belarus as well. And I hope that we know how this playbook operates inside in Georgia. And I hope that our Western supporters and Western friends know, and they've learned a lot in Ukraine, and hopefully that similar mistakes will not be made. So I really want to stay positive that we all win in this big fight. And Slava Ukraine.
And Slava Georgi, Sakartvelo. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Givi, for being with us. And I just would like to remind you that we've been discussing all the situation and all the protests which are happening in Georgia and what is political situation with Givi Chanukvadze, international development expert and associate professor at Ilia State University in Tbilisi. And this was podcast Safe and Safe Country, and me, its host, Alina Frolova. This podcast is a joint project of the Center for Defense Strategies, Ukrainskaya Pravda, and Media Center Ukraine. Please follow us on all the podcast platforms of Ukrainskaya Pravda, Apple Podcast, YouTube, Spotify, SoundCloud, and others. Safe and safe country. It depends on each of us how soon the prefix "on" will disappear. Thanks.